So I got something very personal and perhaps very relatable to some of our listeners today on Disruptarian Radio. This is a topic it's been close to my heart for years now, but I haven't always had the courage to talk about it openly.
Oh, I think this is going to be really important for people to hear, Ryan. You know, these personal stories are often the ones that help others the most, right?
Yeah, exactly. Today we're diving into my personal journey through what's called parental alienation, which is actually the subject of my new ebook, Truth, Integrity, and Fatherhood: A Life Examined. It's essentially, it's the documentation of what happens when one parent systematically works to damage a child's relationship with the other parent.
Man, this hits close to home. As someone who's been through the family court system myself, I know just how devastating this can be.
And that's why I wanted to have both of you here for this conversation. It's not an easy topic, but it's one that affects so many families in silence, and I think it's time to, bring it into the light a bit more and maybe help others who are experiencing the same thing feel less alone in all of this. So my experience with parental alienation, it really started to become clear back in 2015. But the warning signs, they were there much earlier. During some of our arguments, my ex-wife would actually say things like, "I'll turn the kids against you if you divorce me." At the time, I didn't fully grasp just how serious that threat was,
God, that's such a clear red flag when you look back at it now, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's why in May 2015, I created this online group dedicated to documenting cases of parental alienation. It wasn't just like some random interest I had. It was because I was starting to get really, really worried that what she had been threatening might actually become reality.
So you were basically preparing for what you feared might happen?
Yeah, exactly that. I was still holding on to hope that we could fix things, that our marriage could get back to where it once was. But at the same time, something in me just knew I needed to understand this phenomenon better and connect with others going through it.
What happened then? Like, how did things progress from there?
So between 2014 and 2020, I actually filed for divorce 3 times. First in Idaho, then twice in Hawaii. It was this long, drawn-out process that finally completed in February 2020. During that period, my son actually moved with me to Seattle for about 4 months, but then, the pandemic hit and everything changed.
3 times? That must have been incredibly draining, both emotionally and financially.
It was exhausting. Each time I filed, there would be this period where we'd try to reconcile, But the same patterns kept emerging. The threats about the kids became more frequent, and I started noticing subtle ways she was positioning herself as the victim to friends and family, creating this narrative where I was somehow the bad guy.
That sounds like such a slow-burning trauma. You know what I mean? Like this gradual realization that something terrible is happening, but you can't quite stop it?
That's exactly what it felt like, a slow-burning trauma. There were good days where I'd think, maybe I'm overreacting. And then there would be these moments where it became crystal clear that this was a deliberate campaign. And the most painful part was watching my relationship with my kids start to change in ways I couldn't control.
So, Ryan, looking back now, what would you say were the early warning signs of parental alienation that maybe others might miss in their own relationships? Like, apart from the direct threats your ex made, were there more subtle signs?
Yeah, great question, Sarasa. I think beyond the obvious threats, there were these subtle patterns that I didn't fully recognize at the time. Things like my ex would question my parenting decisions in front of the kids, or she'd make these little comments like, "Daddy's too busy to help with homework," when I was actually working to support the family. And she'd sometimes interrupt when I was disciplining the children, undermining my authority in these small ways.
I noticed similar things in my situation. The ex would call the kids during my time with them and ask if they were okay, as if they might not be safe with me.
Exactly that, Rick. There was this constant undertone of doubt being planted Another thing I noticed was how she'd reframe my normal interactions with the kids. Like if I couldn't attend a school event because of work, instead of explaining the reality, she'd tell them, "Daddy chose not to come," as if it was, like, a preference rather than a necessity.
God, that's so insidious. Do you know what I mean? Like it's the kind of thing that in isolation doesn't seem that bad, but when it's part of a pattern.
That's exactly it. It's death by 1,000 cuts. And looking back, I wish I'd documented everything from the very beginning. Every threat, every undermining comment, every time the narrative about me changed. Because when you're in it, you doubt yourself. You think, am I just being paranoid? But your gut knows something's wrong.
In terms of what you could have done differently, is there anything specific you wish you'd known, or actions you wish you'd taken earlier?
I wish I'd been more direct with the children about what was happening, in age-appropriate ways, of course. I was so focused on being the bigger person and not dragging them into adult issues that I didn't provide them with the tools to recognize manipulation. I also wish I'd gotten into therapy sooner, both for myself and requested it for the kids. Having that neutral third party can be incredibly valuable.
Did you ever confront your ex directly about what she was doing?
I tried a few times, but it usually resulted in more hostility and accusations that I was the one trying to alienate the children from her. It's this bizarre mirror effect that happens. The alienating parent often accuses the targeted parent of exactly what they themselves are doing. That's one of the warning signs right there, when you're constantly being accused of things you're not doing.
That's such a good point about the projection. What about, when it comes to communication? Were there changes there that might have been red flags?
Absolutely. When co-parenting communication becomes weaponized, that's a huge red flag. Suddenly every text or email becomes evidence they're collecting against you, or they might, start insisting on using a co-parenting app for documentation when previously normal communication was fine. It's like they're building a case rather than co-parenting. So there was this critical moment, right, where I realized this wasn't just normal post-divorce tension, but actual parental alienation happening in real time. It was when I discovered that my ex-wife had started painting this completely distorted picture of me to our mutual friends.
What kind of things was she saying?
Well, despite me being really involved as a dad, changing countless diapers, feeding the kids, working from home to be present, maintaining multiple jobs to keep us financially stable, she suddenly started characterizing me as misogynistic and uninvolved in household responsibilities. And that was personally hurtful, but what really cemented my decision to finally go through with the divorce was when she began attributing similar attitudes to our son.
Wait, she was saying your son was misogynistic too?
Yeah, exactly. She claimed he had refused to clean his room and allegedly said he didn't have to because he had sisters. And when I questioned my son about this, he completely denied saying it. And knowing my son's character, he's always been honest, diplomatic, able to see multiple perspectives. I believed him. I knew that wasn't him.
So she was essentially putting words in his mouth then? That's really disturbing,
Exactly. What I think probably happened was just a typical teenage moment, Maybe he said something like, "No, how about my sisters do it? I'm busy," which, let's be honest, is just normal sibling stuff. But she took that and reframed it as evidence that he was developing misogyny and that he was learning it from me.
That's the insidious nature of parental alienation right there. Taking completely normal childhood behaviors and recontextualizing them to fit a narrative that serves the alienating parent's goals.
Absolutely, Rick. And what made it so clear to me was that this wasn't just about her being angry with me anymore. She was actively working to reshape how our children viewed themselves and their relationship with me. It was like watching someone rewrite reality in real time.
That must have been absolutely devastating to witness. Was there a particular moment where you just thought, "Oh my God, this is really happening"?
Yeah, there was this This dinner we had shortly before I filed for divorce the last time. My son had mentioned something positive about a day we'd spent together, and I watched her face just change. And after he left the room, she made this comment about how I was manipulating him by being the fun parent. And I realized then that any positive interaction between me and my children was going to be recast as something sinister.
I've been there, man. In my case, when my kids would come home excited about something we'd done together, suddenly they'd have new memories about how they were actually scared or uncomfortable during our time together. It's like their experiences were being retroactively edited.
Yes, that's exactly it. And it's so subtle that the kids don't even realize it's happening to them. But you can see it unfolding, and it's like watching a slow-motion car crash that you can't stop.
So, I think I can offer some, perspective here that might help, especially about the family court system. In my case, when my ex-wife filed for full custody, I was absolutely terrified, right? The system often feels like it's stacked against fathers from the start.
How did you approach it? Because I felt completely blindsided when I entered that system.
Well, unlike you, Ryan, I actually went in expecting the worst, which, in a weird way, helped me prepare better. The first thing I did was document absolutely everything. And I mean everything. Text messages, emails, cancelled visits, times when she wouldn't let me speak to the kids on the phone. I created this, massive timeline with evidence for each incident.
That's really smart, actually. Did you have a good solicitor as well?
Yeah, that was key. I didn't just get any attorney. I specifically found one who had experience with parental alienation cases. That made a huge difference because they knew exactly what to look for and how to present it to the judge. They weren't learning about alienation tactics on my dime. You know what I mean?
That's actually something I wish I'd done differently. My first attorney seemed to think this was just a standard divorce situation.
Exactly. And it's not. It's so not. Another thing that really helped my case was getting a guardian ad litem appointed for the kids. Having that neutral third party who could observe the dynamics and report to the court was absolutely crucial. Because when this person saw how my ex would talk about me in front of the kids, or how she'd forget to tell me about school events, it validated everything I'd been saying.
And did you find the judge was receptive to understanding parental alienation? Because I've heard that can be a real challenge.
It was a bit of an uphill battle at first. The judge initially seemed skeptical about the whole concept, but what really turned things around was when the court-appointed psychologist identified specific alienation behaviours. Having that professional validation was game-changing.
Did you have to deal with false allegations as part of the process? That was something that really blindsided me.
Oh man, absolutely. There were these vague allegations of creating an unsafe environment that came out of nowhere. But because I had been documenting everything for so long, I could show the court that these claims only emerged after I filed a motion about her interfering with visitation. The timing was just too convenient,
That pattern is so familiar.
Right? And I think what ultimately swayed the court in my case was showing that despite everything, I never spoke negatively about their mother to the kids. I kept taking the high road even when it was really, really hard. The court eventually saw that maintaining our 50-50th custody was in the kids' best interest.
Do you think the courts are getting better at recognising parental alienation?
I think it's slowly improving. There's more research and awareness now, but the system still moves at a glacial pace, and that's something parents need to be prepared for. Ryan, your situation sounds so much more complex and frankly more severe than mine was. But the principles of documentation, getting the right specialised help, and maintaining your integrity throughout the process, those are universal.
One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this whole experience has been watching the changes in my children over time. My son especially. He was this energetic, cape-wearing little boy with such traditional boy energy, if that makes sense. Always running around, climbing things, And over the years, I've seen such a significant transformation in his personality and how he expresses himself. It's been, well, dramatic.
And you've mentioned your daughter has also gone through some significant changes as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. My daughter she's begun taking testosterone as part of gender-affirming care, and I want to be really clear about something here. I absolutely support my children's authentic journeys. Like, that's not even a question for me. I want them to be who they truly are.
But I'm sensing there's something about the timing or circumstances that concerns you.
Exactly that. It's the context that keeps me up at night. These profound changes have happened in an environment where I believe my relationship with them has been systematically undermined. And it's really hard to separate what might be their authentic self-discovery from what might be influenced by the alienation. You know what I mean?
Have you noticed these changes coinciding with specific events in the alienation process?
That's actually a really good question. The home environment they live in now is just so dramatically different from what we had established during our marriage. Their step-parent has introduced completely different values and lifestyle choices. And again, families evolve and change. That's natural. But when it's combined with all these active alienation tactics we've been discussing, it creates this perfect storm for parental estrangement.
It must be incredibly difficult to navigate supporting their identity development while also questioning the influences at play.
It really is. Like, on one hand, I want to affirm who they are and who they're becoming, but on the other hand, I can't help but wonder if they're being subtly pushed in certain directions. And the really painful thing is that I'm not allowed to be part of those conversations. I'm not included in therapy appointments or major decisions. I'm just expected to accept everything without question.
That exclusion from the decision-making process is something I face too. It's maddening.
Absolutely maddening. And what makes it even harder is that I feel like if I express any concerns at all, it'll be twisted and used as evidence that I'm not supportive. So I'm in this impossible position where showing any hesitation about the context, not even about their identities themselves, gets framed as rejection. And that just pushes them further away.
That sounds like such a delicate tightrope to walk.
It is. And you know what's really heartbreaking? When I do get those rare moments with my children, I can still see glimpses of who they were. These little flashes of their core personalities that I recognize. And it reminds me that underneath all of this, they're still my kids. They've just been caught in this terrible situation that no child should have to navigate.
Ryan, this situation sounds incredibly complex. How do you actually manage to balance supporting your children's identities while still having these very legitimate concerns about parental alienation? Like, in practical terms, what does that look like for you?
Well, it's probably the hardest balancing act I've ever had to do, if I'm being honest. I try to focus on creating a safe space where they know that I love them unconditionally, regardless of, how they identify or express themselves. But at the same time, I'm careful not to immediately affirm everything without any discussion, because that doesn't feel authentic either.
And do you find yourself second-guessing your own reactions sometimes? Wondering if you're responding to the alienation rather than to your children?
God, all the time. That's exactly it. There are moments when I catch myself wondering, am I questioning this because I genuinely have concerns, or am I just feeling defensive because I've been pushed out? And then I spiral into this whole internal debate about whether I'm actually being the problem. It's mentally exhausting.
I've been there, man. It's like you're constantly policing your own thoughts, trying to figure out what's a reasonable parental concern versus what might be your own reaction to the alienation.
Exactly. And the truth is, sometimes I don't know. Sometimes I genuinely can't tell where the line is. But I've found that the most important thing is just to be present, to keep showing up even when it's hard, to let them know that my door is always open for conversation, for questions, for anything, really.
Have you found any particular approaches or, specific phrases that help when you're trying to navigate these conversations with your children?
I've learned to ask a lot of open-ended questions. Things like, what does this mean to you? Or how long have you been feeling this way? rather than immediately jumping to conclusions or expressing my concerns right off the bat. I try to understand their perspective first, even if I suspect there's external influence at play.
That sounds really wise, actually.
Well, I don't know about wise, it's more like trial and error, you know. I've made plenty of mistakes, said the wrong thing, reacted too strongly, but I'm learning, and I think what helps is reminding myself that my children are intelligent individuals with their own minds. They might be influenced, sure, but they're not just empty vessels being filled with someone else's ideas.
That's an important point. I found with my kids that respecting their agency, even while questioning the context, was crucial to maintaining our relationship.
Absolutely. And you know what's really challenging? The developmental piece of all this. Like, teenagers are supposed to be figuring out who they are. That's normal. They're supposed to be trying on different identities and pushing boundaries. So how do you distinguish between normal teenage exploration and something that might be encouraged in an unhealthy way? That's the million-dollar question.
Do you have any thoughts on how to tell the difference?
I think consistency is one marker. If the changes seem to come out of nowhere and don't align with anything you've observed in your child before, that might be a red flag. But even that's not foolproof because kids don't always share everything they're thinking and feeling with their parents. So in the end, I try to stay curious rather than judgmental, and I document everything, not to build a case, but just to preserve reality as I see it.
That makes so much sense. And it's clear you're really trying to put your children first through all of this.
You know, when we talk about parental alienation, we're not just talking about individual family dramas playing out in isolation. This is actually, it's reflecting these much deeper tensions in society about how we view families, about gender roles, about who should have power in parent-child relationships. It's complicated stuff.
I've been thinking about that too, like how much this seems to connect to larger cultural battles we're having. Do you think there's something about our current moment that's making parental alienation more common? Or are we just more aware of it now?
That's a really good question. I think it's probably both, right? We have more awareness now, but we also have these shifting family structures that create more opportunities for conflict. The nuclear family isn't necessarily the default anymore, and while that can be really positive in many ways, it also means we're navigating new territories without clear roadmaps.
Something I've noticed in my experience with the courts is how unprepared the legal system seems to be for dealing with the psychological complexity of these cases. Like, judges are making decisions based on legal frameworks that don't necessarily account for the subtle ways alienation can happen.
Absolutely. And the research is really clear on this point. Children benefit immensely from having healthy relationships with both parents after divorce. There was this meta-analysis I read that looked at something like 60 different studies, and it consistently showed that kids with involved fathers and mothers had better outcomes across the board, academically, emotionally, even physically.
But that assumes both parents are, fit parents, right? I mean, there must be situations where limiting contact with one parent is actually the right call.
Oh, for sure. If there's actual abuse or neglect happening, that's a completely different situation. The problem is that alienation often masquerades as protection, An alienating parent will say they're protecting the child from the other parent's harmful influence, when in reality the only harm is the alienation itself.
That's really insidious. How does that kind of manipulation affect children psychologically? Like, what are we seeing in terms of long-term effects?
The research on this is pretty devastating, to be honest. Kids who experience severe parental alienation often develop what psychologists call splitting, where they see one parent as all good and the other as all bad. And that black and white thinking doesn't just stay contained to their view of their parents. It affects how they approach all relationships.
I've seen that with friends who grew up in that environment. They struggle with trust issues well into adulthood, and they often repeat the pattern in their own relationships. either becoming alienators themselves or choosing partners who alienate them.
Exactly, and there's this guilt that eventually comes up for many alienated children when they get older and realize what happened. They have to reconcile with the fact that they participated in rejecting a parent who actually loved them. That's a heavy burden for anyone to carry.
God, that's heartbreaking. And I imagine it affects their sense of identity too. Like if half of who you are comes from someone you've been taught to reject.
You hit the nail on the head there. It creates this profound internal conflict because deep down, children know they are a product of both parents. So when they're forced to reject one parent, they're in some ways rejecting a part of themselves. And that self-rejection can lead to all kinds of issues: depression, anxiety, substance abuse.
What frustrates me is how preventable this all is. Like, with proper education for family court professionals, with better co-parenting resources after divorce, we could spare so many kids this trauma.
Absolutely. And that's honestly why I wrote my book and why I'm talking about this so openly. Because we need to bring this issue out of the shadows. It's not just about my personal story, it's about creating awareness of a problem that's affecting countless families across different backgrounds and belief systems.
So, I think it might be helpful if I share some of the specific strategies that actually worked for me when I was fighting my own custody battle. Because, there are practical things you can do when you're facing alienation attempts.
Yeah, that would be incredibly valuable. I mean, what worked for you in terms of documentation? That's something I've really struggled with.
Documentation was absolutely critical in my case. I started keeping what I called my reality journal. Basically, a detailed record of every interaction, every conversation, every visit with my kids. And not just, what happened, but also context, tone, who said what, everything.
Did you use a special app or something for that? Or was it just pen and paper?
Both, actually. I had a physical notebook for quick notes, but I also there's this co-parenting app called Our Family Wizard that timestamps everything and can't be altered later. The court actually really respected that evidence because it couldn't be manipulated. You know what I mean?
That's really smart. I wish I had done more of that systematic documentation early on.
Another huge thing, and this was hard, I committed to never ever speaking negatively about my ex in front of the kids. Even when she was saying awful things about me, even when I was so angry, I could barely function. And that paid off because eventually my kids noticed the difference.
That must have been really difficult to maintain though, right? Like in those moments when you know someone's been lying about you.
God, yes. It was probably the hardest part, to be honest. But I found that focusing on being consistent and reliable was more important than defending myself. Kids are smart. They notice patterns. They see who shows up no matter what.
What about legal tactics? Anything specific that helped you there?
I got a really good attorney who specifically had experience with parental alienation cases. That was crucial. And we requested a custody evaluation with a psychologist who understood the dynamics of alienation. That evaluation was expensive, really expensive, but it completely changed the trajectory of my case.
And how did you handle communication with your ex during all this? That seems like it would be so difficult.
I went completely grey rock. Do you know that technique? It's where you make yourself as boring and non-reactive as possible. No emotional responses, no arguments, just factual, brief communication about the kids. It was actually my therapist who suggested it, and it took away my ex's ability to provoke me into reactions she could use against me.
I've tried something similar, but it's hard to maintain sometimes.
Oh, totally. And look, I still slipped up sometimes. But the other thing I did was build a really solid support network. Friends who understood what I was going through. A good therapist and a support group specifically for targeted parents. Having places to vent meant I wasn't bringing that energy into my limited time with my kids.
What about during the actual court proceedings? Any specific approaches that worked there?
Yes, I focused on the children's best interests rather than attacking my ex. Instead of saying, she's alienating the kids, I'd frame it as, The children benefit from having both parents actively involved in their lives. And here's the evidence they're struggling with the current arrangement. Judges respond so much better to that child-centered approach.
That's really good advice. I think I've sometimes fallen into the trap of just trying to prove I was wronged rather than focusing on what's best for the kids.
Exactly. And the final thing, patience. This was a marathon, not a sprint. The court case took almost 2 years, and there were so many moments where I wanted to just give up. But consistent, steady presence eventually made the difference.
You know, we've been talking about strategies and documentation, but the emotional toll of all this has been, well, it's been absolutely devastating at times. There were periods where I was just completely consumed by depression. I mean, having your own children turn against you. It's like nothing else I've ever experienced.
God, I can't even imagine what that feels like. Did you have support during those times?
Not enough, to be honest. And there were some really dark moments where I actually had suicidal thoughts. It's hard to admit that, but when you feel like you've lost your children, like you failed at the most important job in your life, those thoughts can creep in.
That's absolutely heartbreaking, Ryan. How did you get through those moments?
Well, it's going to sound strange, but I kept going for one simple reason. My kids might need me someday. Even if they didn't want me around right then, I couldn't. I couldn't bear the thought of them someday reaching out and me not being there. That was my anchor, you know what I mean?
Man, I've been there too. Not exactly the same, but those feelings of worthlessness, of questioning everything, they're brutal.
Exactly. And you know what's particularly tough? The isolation. Because most people they don't understand parental alienation. They hear that your kids don't want to see you and immediately assume you must have done something terrible. So you end up suffering in silence a lot of the time.
Did you find therapy helpful during this time? Or like any particular coping mechanisms?
Therapy was absolutely essential. Finding a therapist who actually understood parental alienation made all the difference. And I also started journaling extensively, not just documenting events, but processing my feelings. It became this way of talking to my future kids, explaining my side of the story.
Physical activity helped me a ton too. Did you find anything like that?
Yeah, hiking became my therapy. Being out in nature, just moving my body when my mind was in such a dark place. It didn't fix anything, but it gave me these moments of, I don't know, peace maybe? Just enough to keep going.
And what about now? Has the emotional impact, has it changed over time?
It has. The acute pain has transformed into something more chronic, I guess, like grief that you learn to carry. Some days are still incredibly hard, but I've developed better tools for managing those emotions. And writing the book was actually really healing, taking all that pain and hopefully creating something that might help others. So, let's talk about resources, because I think this is really important for anyone going through this nightmare. When I first realized what was happening, I felt so alone, like I was the only person experiencing this.
Yeah, and that isolation can make everything so much worse, right? What kind of support did you eventually find that actually helped?
Well, first and foremost, online support groups were absolutely life-changing for me. There's something incredibly powerful about connecting with other parents who just get it, who understand exactly what you're going through without you having to explain or justify yourself.
I found the same thing. Those groups become like a lifeline when you're drowning. Did you find any specific organizations that were particularly helpful?
Yeah, organizations like the Parental Alienation Awareness Organization and the National Parents Organization have tons of resources. They provide everything from educational materials to legal guidance, even referrals to therapists who specialize in parental alienation.
And speaking of therapists, how important was professional help in your journey?
Oh, it was essential. And this is really important, like you need a therapist who actually understands parental alienation, because a therapist who doesn't get it might actually make things worse. They might inadvertently reinforce the alienation narrative.
That's so true. I went through 3 therapists before finding one who really understood the dynamics at play. And then it made a world of difference in how I approached the whole situation.
Exactly. And for anyone listening who's dealing with this, I'd strongly recommend looking for someone with specific training in family systems and high conflict divorces. Someone who understands the difference between estrangement and alienation.
Are there any books or resources that you found particularly helpful that people could start with right away?
Definitely. Divorce Poison by Dr. Richard Warshak was like my Bible during the worst of it. And Adult Children of Parental Alienation Syndrome by Amy Baker gives this incredible perspective from adults who experienced alienation as children and then reconnected with their targeted parents later in life. That one gave me a lot of hope, actually.
Legal resources are crucial too. I found that connecting with fathers' rights groups helped me navigate the court system much more effectively. They often have lists of attorneys who understand parental alienation.
Absolutely. And documenting everything is so important. I actually created a specific email address just for communications with my ex and kept all records there. There are even co-parenting apps now that keep records of all communications, which can be invaluable in court.
And what about day-to-day coping? Do you have suggestions for just getting through it?
The day-to-day is the hardest part sometimes. Having a good friend who will just listen without judgment, that's priceless. And not everyone in your life will be able to do that. So finding those people who can just sit with you in your pain without trying to fix it or judge it, that's really important. So, one of the ways I've tried to process all of this, and hopefully help others at the same time, was by writing my ebook, Truth, Integrity, and Fatherhood, A Life Examined. I mean, there was something really therapeutic about getting it all down on paper, you know?
I was really excited to talk about this, actually. What specifically made you decide to write a book about your experience? Was it something you'd always planned to do? Or was there, a moment when you just thought, I need to do this?
It wasn't really planned, no. It started as just journaling, actually. My therapist suggested documenting everything as a way to maintain my own sanity, honestly. I'd find myself doubting my own memories sometimes, you know? That's part of what makes alienation so insidious. You start questioning your own reality.
Man, I know exactly what you mean. That gaslighting effect is so real.
Exactly. But as I kept writing, I realized this documentation wasn't just for me. It was for my kids. I wanted there to be a record of the truth, something they could read someday when they're older, and starting to question the narrative they've been given.
That's really powerful, Ryan. And what about, other parents going through this? Was that part of your thinking too?
Absolutely. The more I wrote, the more I realized that my story, while unique in its details, followed patterns that so many alienated parents experience. And I thought if I could help even one other parent feel less alone or navigate this nightmare a bit better, well, that would give some meaning to my pain.
What would you say are the most important insights from the book that might help someone who's just starting to recognize these patterns in their own life?
Well, first, trust your gut. So many targeted parents talk about how they knew something was wrong but dismissed their own instincts. Second, document everything from day one. Conversations, incidents, broken agreements, everything.
That seems so important, yeah.
And third, and this was really hard for me, you have to accept that you can't control how your ex portrays you to your children. You can only control how you show up. Consistency and patience become your best weapons.
Did writing the book change how you think about your own situation at all? Did you have any revelations while you were putting it all together?
That's a great question. I think the biggest revelation was realizing how much I'd been carrying alone. There was this incredible release in putting it on paper. And I also saw patterns I hadn't recognized before, how certain triggers would lead to escalations in the alienation tactics.
I found your chapters on maintaining your own mental health particularly helpful. That's something a lot of alienated parents struggle with.
Because it's just so exhausting, right? Fighting a battle that often feels unwinnable while trying to stay positive for your kids. In the book, I talk a lot about finding meaning beyond the parent identity, because when that's under attack, you need other sources of self-worth to stay afloat. So I wanted to mention that Parental Alienation Awareness Day is coming up on April 25th and 26th, 2025. It's actually become a really important date for me personally, kind of like, a moment to recognize that this isn't just my struggle, but something that affects families everywhere.
Oh, I didn't even know there was an awareness day for this. Like, how did that come about? And what sort of things happen on those days?
It started back in the early 2000s, actually, as a grassroots effort by parents who were experiencing exactly what we've been talking about. They wanted to shine a light on something that was mostly happening in the shadows of family court systems. Now, there are events in like over 30 countries with people wearing blue ribbons to show solidarity.
I participated last year, did a small gathering at a local park with some other parents from my support group. It was powerful just to be visible. This stuff thrives in isolation.
And what can our listeners do if they want to get involved? Like, is there anywhere they can go? Or anything they can do to show support?
Absolutely. One of the simplest things is just sharing information on social media. Use hashtags like PEAware or Parental Alienation Awareness. There's also usually local events, candlelight vigils, information sessions, that kind of thing.
Don't forget contacting your representatives. I've found that most lawmakers have no idea how prevalent this issue is, or how destructive it can be to families.
That's such a good point. And for anyone who's directly affected, reaching out to support groups around this time can be really helpful. There's something really healing about connecting with others who truly get it, especially around awareness days when emotions can be pretty raw.
It strikes me that this is one of those issues that, it really crosses all political boundaries, right? Like, this isn't a left or right thing at all.
Exactly. That's what makes it so frustrating sometimes. Parental alienation isn't about politics. It's about children's fundamental right to love and be loved by both parents. The Awareness Day really tries to emphasize that point, that this is a human issue, not a political football.
And for those who maybe aren't directly affected but want to be allies, just listening and believing parents who share their stories is huge. One of the hardest parts of alienation is not being believed.
Man, you hit the nail on the head there. Sometimes just being seen and heard is the thing that keeps you going another day. One of the hardest parts of this whole journey has been maintaining some kind of hope. There were definitely days where I couldn't see any light at the end of this tunnel, but I've had to keep reminding myself that children grow up. Their understanding of the world changes as they get older.
Absolutely. Like, kids develop their own critical thinking skills, don't they? They start to question things and form their own opinions about what happened in their childhood.
That's exactly what I've seen in my situation. My oldest is now in his late teens, and he started asking me questions about what actually happened during the divorce. It's like he's piecing together a puzzle that didn't make sense to him before.
That's really encouraging to hear, Rick. I've been holding on to this belief that someday my kids will start to question the narrative they've been given. I mean, I've documented everything, not because I want to, prove I was right or anything, but just to preserve the truth for when they're ready to hear it.
So you're essentially keeping the door open for them, right? Even though they might not be walking through it right now.
Exactly. I've decided to remain present in their lives. However small that presence might be allowed to be. The alternative was to just remove myself entirely, and I just couldn't do that. Because what if they need me someday,
Man, I remember that feeling so well. You're essentially saying, I'll take the pain of being rejected over and over if it means being available when they finally reach out.
Yeah, and the weird thing is, having that perspective has actually helped me cope with some of the darker moments. When I was really struggling with, those thoughts of just ending it all, what kept me going was this voice in my head saying, what if they call tomorrow? What if next year they need you?
That's incredibly powerful, Ryan. And do you think that, there's a certain age where children are more likely to start questioning things, or is it really different for everyone?
I think it varies a lot. Some kids start questioning in their late teens, like Rick mentioned. Others might not really process it until they're in their 20s or even 30s. Sometimes it's triggered by a life event. Maybe they become parents themselves, or they experience a relationship breakdown that makes them reflect on their own childhood.
In my experience, it often happens when they witness inconsistencies that they just can't reconcile anymore. My son noticed that the stories he'd been told about me didn't match the father he actually saw when we were together.
And how do you prepare yourself for that moment? Like if your children do come to you someday, wanting to understand what happened?
That's such a good question. I try to focus on healing myself first, because I don't want to respond from a place of bitterness or anger. I want to be able to discuss what happened objectively without, vilifying their other parent, because ultimately that would just put them in another impossible position.
Exactly. They need to know you understand how complicated their feelings are. They're not just going to flip a switch and suddenly see everything clearly.
Right, and I think maintaining that hope while also accepting the present reality is the real balancing act. I can hope for reconciliation without putting my entire life on hold waiting for it. So as we wrap up today's really powerful conversation, I just want to say that if you're out there listening and dealing with parental alienation, please know that you're not alone. Like, this is something that affects so many families, and yet it's still not talked about enough,
Absolutely. And that's why your book is such an important resource, Ryan. Can you tell our listeners where they can find Truth, Integrity and Fatherhood, A Life Examined?
Yeah, of course. The ebook is available on my website, Disruptarian.com. You can also find links to all the resources we mentioned today, the support groups, the legal information, everything. I've tried to compile everything I wish I'd had access to when I was first going through this.
And man, I really want to emphasize something here. Documentation is key. Like, seriously, start keeping records of everything if you're experiencing this. Text messages, emails, missed visitations, all of it. It might seem excessive now, but trust me, it's invaluable later.
That's such an important point, Rick. Documentation isn't just for court battles either. It's for your own sanity sometimes, and eventually it might help your children understand what actually happened.
I think another really important takeaway from today's discussion is that healing is possible, right? Like, even in the darkest moments, there are paths forward and ways to maintain your relationship with your children, even if it looks different than you imagined.
Exactly. And remember that Parental Alienation Awareness Day is coming up on April 25th and 26th, 2025. It's a great opportunity to get involved and help raise awareness about this issue.
And maybe share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Because honestly, sometimes just knowing you're not alone in this experience can make all the difference.
I want to thank both of you, Rick and Saoirse, for being part of this conversation today. It's not an easy topic, but these are the discussions we need to have on Disruptarian Radio.
Thanks for having me and for your courage in sharing your story, Ryan.
Yes, thank you so much for your vulnerability and honesty. I really believe your story is going to help so many people who are struggling with similar situations.
And thank you to all our listeners for joining us. Remember, stay strong, your truth matters, and your love for your children matters. We'll catch you on the next episode of Disruptarian Radio. We want to thank Wondercraft.ai for the use of their voice actors. They have great tools, and we are proud to have them as partners in our podcast creation process.